Right, in question 3.1, they're saying, let's just have a look at the instructions which apply to all the questions. The code for the input of all the variables has been done unless otherwise specified. There are one or two questions where you have to indicate some code. This could be done in Delphi, obviously, or within this document as a worksheet. Now, error checking needs to be done unless specifically asked for, and there are some questions that specifically ask for error checking. Any code already given is also shown. All the necessary variables have been declared, but you can use others. You can use others if you wish to. All the code you write can be entered in spaces provided to the extent that is needed. Okay, so write code to check if the user has added any text in an edit control edit.surname. Now that's a very common thing because we need to check up on users that they've actually entered valid input or any input at all. Okay, and you're used to doing that, when you enter those forms online and there's a little red star alongside of it to indicate that it's mandatory or compulsory to enter a value and you don't. It normally very annoyingly tells you right at the end that you've forgotten to fill them in and makes you restart all over from scratch again. But the idea would be that that once the user has clicked a button or exited the control or whatever it happens to be, that you could do a check to say sorry, and then give them a message, sorry, but you didn't enter any text in there, etc., etc. So there isn't. We can assume that there's a control called edit.surname, and the property that we would look at for the edit surname, the text property that we would look at is edit surname.text would be the actual property that stores the value if there has been any entered. Okay, so essentially what we would do is we would have something fairly simple like that, and we'd say, right, if the length of edit surname.text, in other words, that's where the text is stored, if it's equal to 0, in other words, there are no characters, then show message or give them a nice message dialog. We're just using a show message here. For all these outputs, you could just use show messages. This is not a full program that we're writing. So no text has been entered. Okay. And obviously with other types of information, you could do more checks. So for example, if it's an ID number, which I think is the next question, then you know that not only must it be text, it must be 13 characters and it must be 13 digits. Okay, so some of the information is really difficult to check on a surname, whether it's valid or not, other than it's entered some text. Some text has been entered. You'll have to decide whether you can accept names like RTD2 and things like that. But let's assume for now that you'll only use characters, but we're not using that in this question. We're just checking that some text has been entered. Right, this is the one we were talking about just prior to the other question. We said write code to check if an ID number is valid. In other words, it consists of only 13 digits. Okay, this ID is equal. The two things that have actually got to be checked is one is that there are 13 characters, okay, and that they are all digits. Essentially, is what we're saying. You can have 13 characters, but they might not all be digits, for example. Or you could have 13 digits plus some other characters. In other words, which case the length is not the same. So. And we touched on that in one of the previous examples in question 2. So essentially what the first thing I'm going to have to do is count how many digits I've got in that ID number. Okay, I'm going to count it. So I set my iCount variable, or whichever variable you wish to use, equal to 0. And the variable that I'm going to use is SID. They suggested we use SID. Okay, the variable name is not terribly important here. Obviously you need to be consistent within your example. Okay, now that's fairly standard, this part here. Right, so that's for 1 to the length, though we saw in the previous question there was one that started at 2, but generally if you want to process every single character, you can have that standard from 1 I equals 1. Remember, you can refer to the whole thing as SID or the individual compartments. So it is like a block of flats. The SID is the block of flats, it's the whole thing with all the tenants, and if you want to get to the individual characters or tenants in it, then you refer to them with square brackets in it. So I'm testing here and that will go from 1 to however many characters happen to be in SID. Okay, that one there in fact is a valid one, so there are 13, so it would run from 1 to 13. So it would test each character, character 1, character 2, character 3, character 4, character 5, character 6, character 7. And every time it And there are other ways you could check. You could check with the pos function. Okay, but I'll just use this one. If that character is in the 0 to 9, you might say, but why they got quotes on if you're using 0 to 9? Because remember, it's stored in a string. Okay, it's stored in a string. So if that's correct, then we increment the count. And the temptation is to say, right, well, if the count's 13, because there must be 13 digits in an ID number, then it must be right. Okay, but what about this type of problem? Oops, daisy. Okay, this type of problem where somebody goes and puts a random letter or a hashtag or a $ or something at the end by mistake. Okay, can't make up my mind. I've got so many characters to choose from. Okay, it's a hash sign. Okay, now that's no longer valid. Okay, so there are actually two things I need to check. I need to check that there are only 13 characters in it, and that all 13 characters are digits. Okay, so that's an easy one to slip on here, and they do suggest that here. Check that there are 13 digits and the string length was 13 to catch this type of example. Okay, and they've added a few extra characters on. So there's 13 digits there, not a problem, but there are also some letters stacked on there, so that's not a valid ID number. So you need to check that if A, there were 13 characters, okay, which is quite easy because we could check the length, and we also need to check that count is equal to 13. Those things must both be true. Okay, so if the count is 13, it means it found 13 digits, and the length is 13. Then it means that all 13 characters, there were only 13 characters, and all of them were digits. Okay, all of them were digits, obviously, else it's not a valid ID. And obviously there are other reasons why an ID might not be valid, because we know the first couple of characters represent days and months, and so obviously they've got restrictions on as well. Plus there's some others as well. So that was a tricky one there, because I think the temptation would be that most people would say that and forget to go and check that. Okay, so that's an interesting one that we had, and it was very similar to one we had in question 2 as well. Okay, here they say write some code to calculate the percentage of vowels, either uppercase or lowercase, a variable s text contains. So if s text was equal to a, b, 2a, e, u, a, there's 7 characters in that string variable, 5 of them are vowels. Okay, capital B, capital A, capital E, capital U, and small a. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Sorry, yeah, I think I counted right. 5 in total. So 5 out of 7, 5 divided by 7 times 100. So essentially I need two things to calculate the percentage. The length of the string. Oh, wait a minute, I've got a length function, so that's done. So all I need to do is count how many vowels there are, uppercase and lowercase, and then I must format my output to 1 decimal place. Okay. And again, even if they don't give you that example, think of an example and think, how would you go through it? Essentially, I'm going to go through each character in the loop. Now, that sounds very familiar. And I would set my count equal to 0 to start off with, because I want to count how many variables there are. I want to count how many vowels there are. Okay. Right. For I equals 1 to the length. Now, I've put in 2 if statements because they both work, and you might have a preference for one or the other. Okay, I'm going to go to the second one here and say, right, if s text I loop, okay, remember that becomes 1, 2, 3, in our case we'll go up to 7, and it can check it if that is in A, E, I, O, U, comma, A, E, I, O, U, and that's to sort out the lowercase, uppercase issue. So it can either be a capital vowel or a lowercase vowel. If there's a match, okay, then it increments the count. Okay, I've put this in as a comment here. I've put this in as a comment here because this one also works as well. If we say, right, take the character and test if it's in this string. Okay, pos says, right, take this thing, test it if it's in there, and if the answer is greater than 0, means it was found. Then increment the count. So please don't put both of them in. You'll end up with double the answer. But either of those examples will work, and I think some people will naturally find some more natural to them than others. I think maybe the pos one is perhaps just easier, particularly when you've got lots of possible things or possible characters that you might have to have, possibilities you might have to match against. but either of those will work. Okay, so that essentially, now I've actually got everything done because I've gone through each character. I've tested if it's a vowel, uppercase or lowercase, and I've kept on counting them. So I went through and I went, first one, vowel, yes, what? So count as 1, B, no, 2, no, A, okay, so counts 2, E, yes, counts 3, U, yes, and even small a, yes, and I eventually end up with 5. So now I just need to do the calculation, and they suggest I store the calculation in a thing called R percentage. Okay, so R percentage is just I count, which is the number of vowels that you found, uppercase or lowercase, divided by the length of the text. In other words, however long this happened to be. My specific example had 7 characters in. Okay, my specific example had 7 characters in, but obviously it'll work for any example. And then times by 100, of course, to get it as a percentage. And then they said use a show message and just use the result formatted. Okay, so when I think of formatting and it's going to be a decimal number, or potentially a decimal number like 71.3, okay, I'm going to have to use a special type of formatting. Show message percentage of vowels equals plus float to string format, the F standing for format. Okay, float to string just plucks it out there with all the decimals and whatever. Okay, FF fixed means I want a fixed number of decimals, comma 6 is the total space that's used. I just tend to use 6 all the time, to be honest. And 1 is the number of decimal places that will be shown. Okay, so that's float to string F. Okay, because you can make it, remember you can make it FF currency as well if you were outputting currency or something like that. Okay, so that's quite a few marks there. So you would get a mark for the loop, and you would get a correct mark for the test, and the incrementing of the count, and the correct calculation of the percentage. So it's in a shorter test, they might ask you bits and pieces of it. Or alternatively, you could say, right, well, let's take the divide times by 100 out, and say, why is that not calculating the correct percentage? Okay. Or we started to loop at 2 or something. They say, why is it not working out? Well, it's because you're not starting at 2, that type of thing. So it can be an error checking diagnostic logic check as well.